There was a cold in Pittsburgh that December that did more than bite skin. It stripped away the parts of a person that still felt sorry for strangers. It taught you fast, mind your own business or don't survive long enough to regret it. Tessa Quinn should have walked past the boots sticking out from behind the dumpster. In that neighborhood at that hour, stepping over a stranger wasn't cruelty. It was the same rule that kept everyone else on that block alive long enough to complain about the cold in the morning. She didn't walk past. And by the time the sun came up over the Monongahela, the stranger bleeding into the slush behind her building would be gone from her kitchen floor, and a man half the underworld was too afraid to even name would have a new obsession. Her. But right then, all Tessa knew was that her shift had just ended, and her body wanted nothing but a hot shower and 8 hours of silence. Tessa had just walked off a 12-hour shift at the private ambulance dispatch center 2 blocks over, the kind of job where you learned to recognize trouble before it became a headline. Her shoulders ached. Her feet had gone numb an hour ago. It was 3:17 in the morning, and December had teeth. There was a boot sticking out from behind a dumpster in South Side Pittsburgh, and the boot alone told Tessa Quinn that something was wrong. Not the kind of wrong she saw every night on dispatch calls, a different kind, because in that neighborhood at that hour, boots like that didn't exist. Italian leather, hand-stitched, the kind that cost more than her rent, half buried in a frozen puddle behind a row of cracked brick buildings where nobody who owned boots like that had any business standing. She told herself she was imagining things. That exhaustion did that to a person, made shadows into shapes and shapes into threats. She told herself to walk past. She didn't walk past. The boot moved. A breath, ragged and wet, cut through the wind coming off the Monongahela, and Tessa Quinn, 26 years old, curves she'd learned to carry like armor, hair the color of chestnuts, pulled back in a knot too tired to be called neat, crouched down in the alley behind her own apartment building, and found a man half submerged in ice water, his coat soaked through dark blood, spreading along his left side like a shadow that refused to stay in its place. His eyes opened. Just a slit. And even like that, even bleeding out behind a dumpster at 3 in the morning, he looked at her like she was something to be assessed. Not someone. Something. She reached for her phone to call it in, training instinct, the thing 12 years of night shifts had carved into her hands before her brain could even catch up. His fingers closed around her wrist first. The grip was industrial, ice-cold and precise like a machine designed for exactly one purpose, and that purpose was making sure she didn't finish dialing. No hospital. His voice was gravel-dragged over broken glass. No police. That was the moment Tessa understood somewhere beneath her ribs, where the smart, quiet part of her lived, that this was not an ordinary man having an ordinary bad night. She didn't know it yet, but the stranger bleeding out in front of her was one of the most feared Mafia bosses on the eastern seaboard, and Mafia bosses do not forget the hands that save them. She should have called it in anyway. She thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. Then she got her arm under his shoulder and started hauling him toward the back stairwell of her building, because whatever kind of trouble he was, whatever kind of mistake she was about to make, Tessa Quinn had never once in her life been able to walk past someone bleeding. 2 flights of stairs took nearly 10 minutes. He was heavier than he looked, all compressed muscle and dead weight, and twice she had to stop and brace him against the wall while her lungs burned in the cold. The building smelled the way it always smelled, boiled cabbage from 2A, the sweet chemical tang of someone's cheap weed drifting under a door, a radiator somewhere hissing like it resented being asked to work. Ordinary smells, ordinary Tuesday night smells. They felt obscene now, next to the blood soaking through her sleeve. She got him through her door, bolted it, and lowered him onto the kitchen floor because her couch was thrift store fabric and she wasn't ready to explain a bloodstain to herself, let alone to anyone else. Cutting his coat open, her hands moved on autopilot, pressure, assess, stabilize, while her eyes cataloged things she wasn't supposed to notice and couldn't stop noticing anyway. An old hotel key card slid out of his inner pocket and skittered across her linoleum. Brass numbers stamped into worn plastic, 714. A small compass tattoo sat just beneath his jaw on the left side of his throat, inked with a precision that spoke of money, not rebellion. Along his right forearm, a line of Latin script ran from wrist to elbow, the kind of tattoo that meant something to somebody, even if it meant nothing to her. He passed out somewhere in the middle of her cutting the last of the fabric away after finishing half a bottle of cheap vodka she kept in her freezer for emergencies that were never supposed to look like this. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. Really looked, for the first time since she'd found him. A stranger. Bleeding. Shivering, even unconscious. His whole body still fighting the cold that had nearly killed him. She didn't have much. She had one blanket that wasn't threadbare, the one her mother had given her the last Christmas before the hospital bills started. She pulled it off her own bed and laid it over him anyway, tucking it around his shoulders the way you'd tuck it around anyone who couldn't do it for themselves. She sat on the kitchen floor beside him for the next hour, checking the rise and fall of his chest every few minutes, the way she checked patients on a call, telling herself it was just professional habit. It wasn't entirely. Somewhere in that hour, watching a dangerous stranger breathe under her mother's blanket, she stopped being afraid of him and started being afraid of what she'd already decided to feel. By 4 in the morning, her hands had finally stopped shaking. She sat with her back against the cabinet, staring at a man whose name she didn't know, and thought, "I've made a mistake I can't take back." I think I already knew that the moment I saw the boot. Morning came, gray and merciless, the way it always did in Pittsburgh in December. Light filtered through clouds that never quite let the sun all the way in. Before she even discovered he was gone, she heard it, the thin apartment walls doing what thin apartment walls always did, carrying every word like a courtesy nobody asked for. A neighbor's voice, pitched just loud enough to make sure it landed. "Heard the night shift girl drag some drunk home again. Guess that's the only kind of company a body like that's gonna get. Girls like her belong in the dark. Ain't nobody looking twice in daylight." Tessa stood very still in her own hallway and let it land. She had learned a long time ago that dignity wasn't something you announced. It was something you kept quietly, even when the room was trying to take it from you. She didn't answer. She simply opened her apartment door. The apartment was empty. The blanket was folded, not just left and set neatly on the arm of her couch. The floor had been scrubbed clean of every trace of blood. On the kitchen counter sat a stack of $100 bills, $12,000, all crisp, all printed in 2019, next to a plain white business card with nothing on it but a phone number. She counted the money twice, the way you count something you don't quite believe is real, and hid it inside an old tea tin at the back of her cabinet. While she cleaned, she found a half-burned scrap of paper wedged beneath the couch cushion edges, blackened like it had survived a fire someone had tried to make thorough. 714. Ethan don't trust. The rest was ash. She folded it once and slid it into the back of a kitchen drawer, telling herself she'd deal with it later, the way people always tell themselves that about the things that are going to matter most. When she finally looked out her window, there was a black SUV parked across the street, engine idling, a thin ribbon of cigarette smoke curling out through a window cracked exactly 1 inch. She didn't know it yet, but that morning there wasn't only one man watching her building. There were several, and all of them had already decided she mattered. 3 days passed, and Tessa tried to build her life back into something that looked like before. Night shift, walk home, look at the money in the tea tin like it might have grown teeth overnight. It hadn't grown teeth. But her building had grown a new lock, Someone had replaced the front entrance's broken deadbolt overnight with an industrial steel unit that looked like it belonged on a bank vault, not a crumbling walk-up on the south side. In her mailbox, a brass key sat, waiting beside a folded note in handwriting she didn't recognize. Until the old doors fixed. She tried the key on her own apartment door. It didn't fit. Curious, despite every instinct telling her not to be, she carried it with her the next evening, and somewhere between one bus transfer and a long walk along the river, she found herself testing it against the service entrance of a glass tower near the Monongahela waterfront, floor 41. It opened. She stood in a service stairwell that smelled like money and air conditioning, heart-hammering, and thought, "He gave me a key before I even asked for one, which means he never expected me to say no." The same week, a thin, unmarked envelope appeared under her door. Inside, a slip from First Allegheny Bank, a safety deposit box, numbered 2291, and a line of handwriting, "When you need it, use this key." She didn't open the box. She didn't ask questions out loud. But she kept the key tucked deep inside her coat lining, the way you keep something you're not ready to admit you've already decided to use. Detective Harlan Voss showed up on a Thursday morning right as she was leaving for her shift. He didn't come inside. He stood in the hallway, hands in the pockets of a khaki coat that had seen better decades, eyes red-rimmed from sleep he clearly wasn't getting. "There was blood in that alley behind your building," he said, not quite a question. "The Corvo family's been asking around about a man who took a knife to the ribs that same night. If you know anything—" He let the sentence hang there, unfinished, the way threats often dress themselves up as advice. "You'd be smart to forget it." Tessa said nothing. She'd learned that silence, held correctly, could be its own kind of armor. That same day in the break room at dispatch, one of the older coordinators made sure her voice carried far enough to fill the whole room. "Heard somebody dragged a body home the other night. Must be nice having all that muscle to spare. Shame it never made its way up to her head." Tessa didn't turn around. She adjusted her headset and answered the next ambulance call in a voice that never wavered. What none of them knew, what nobody in that building had ever cared to ask, was that Tessa Quinn had walked away from a full accounting scholarship in her sophomore year of college when her mother's cancer bills started arriving faster than anyone could open them. She'd traded a future in numbers for a present in survival, and somewhere along the way, the world had stopped seeing anything about her except the surface. Nobody knew she still read second-hand finance textbooks after midnight, still balanced ledgers for 2 elderly clients just to keep the muscle memory alive, still dreamed in decimal points even while she drove an ambulance dispatch console for a living. She kept that part of herself in a drawer, same as the burned scrap of paper. Locked, private, hers. When Detective Voss finally walked away down the hall, she bent to pick up the cigarette butt he'd dropped without thinking. An unusual brand, expensive, sold as far as she could tell later at exactly one shop near the state capitol in Harrisburg. She put it in her pocket without quite knowing why, only that it felt like the kind of detail worth keeping. After that, she started noticing the shape of her own fear. A figure standing half a block away every time she left the building. Never approaching, just watching the way a held breath watches a room. On the 4th night, Marco Corvo appeared not at her door, but at Mrs. Delaney's, a bouquet of fake flowers in one hand, a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Just stopping by to check on you," he told the old woman sweetly. "On behalf of a friend." Tessa stood on the stairwell above watching the scene unfold and understood with sudden, sickening clarity that whatever danger had followed her stranger into her life had just found its way to the one person in that building who had ever shown her kindness without asking for anything back. Marco cornered a defenseless old woman just to send Tessa a message and walked away smiling. If you were standing in that hallway with 30 seconds to decide, would you have stepped in the way Tessa eventually did, or stayed quiet to keep yourself safe? Pick your side in the comments. I step in, or I stay silent. No sitting on the fence. Tessa moved before she'd fully decided to. By the time she reached the second floor, Marco was already standing inside Mrs. Delaney's apartment, holding an old black and white photograph in one hand, while the old woman's fingers trembled around the doorframe. He turned when Tessa arrived, and his smile widened into something uglier. "You saved the right man," he said. "Now it's your turn to get saved." He didn't hit her. He didn't need to. He simply took her wrist and squeezed hard enough to leave 4 distinct marks that would still be visible the next morning, and leaned in close enough that she could smell cigarettes and expensive cologne layered over something colder underneath. "Next time," he whispered, "I won't bother asking the old lady." Then, before he turned to leave, he raised his voice deliberately cruelly pitched to travel down the hallway and through every thin door in that building. "Everybody take a good look. South Side sweetheart dragging strangers home in the middle of the night. Heard she dropped out of college years back. Mama got sick. Real shame. Guess that's what happens when you're built for lifting, not thinking." A few windows cracked open along the hall. A few faces appeared, half hidden, watching. Tessa straightened her spine and looked him directly in the eyes and said in a voice that didn't shake, "Are you finished?" She would think much later that this was the moment the story truly began. Not the alley, not the blood, but this hallway, this humiliation offered up in front of an audience, and her refusal to let it land the way he wanted it to. She walked back to her apartment on legs that trembled the whole way, hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to pull the white business card from her drawer. She dialed. The line picked up on the first ring, a voice like gravel wrapped in ice. "Talk." She said Marco's name. 8 seconds of silence stretched out longer than the entire call before it. "Back door. 4 minutes. Bring nothing." She was standing at the rear entrance exactly 4 minutes later. The black SUV arrived 3 minutes and 40 seconds after that. The door swung open from the inside. He sat in the shadows of the back seat, his white shirt still marked with a dried stain of blood along the ribs, and when his eyes found the fresh bruises circling her wrist, something moved across his jaw, the first flicker of anything human she'd seen on his face. "He touched something that doesn't belong to him," he said. It wasn't a question. Tessa climbed in without a word, understanding somewhere deep and quiet that there was no walking this back now. Whatever came next, there would be no return to the version of her life that existed before that boot in the alley. The SUV pulled away from the curb and merged onto empty streets, slick with frozen rain streetlights smearing gold across the windshield. Tessa sat rigid against the leather seat, arms crossed over her chest, less for warmth and more to keep her hands from shaking where he could see them. "You didn't have to come," she said finally, because the silence had gone on long enough to feel like its own kind of pressure. "I did," he said. "You just don't know why yet." She studied his profile in the passing light, the sharp architecture of his jaw, the compass tattoo she'd first seen while cutting away his coat, the careful stillness of a man who had trained every muscle in his body not to give anything away for free. "Who are you?" she said. Not a question either, a demand dressed as a statement, because she'd earned the right to ask it plainly. He looked at her for the first time directly. Brown eyes so dark they seemed bottomless in the low light. "Roman Hale," he said, and then, after a pause that felt deliberate, like he was testing how the words sat in his own mouth before offering them to her, "You already know what that means, even if you don't know the details yet." She didn't. Not the syndicate, not the empire, not the weight his name carried in rooms she'd never been allowed into. This was Roman Hale, The Mafia boss. The entire city moved around without ever saying the words out loud. But she understood the shape of it. The money, the silence, the men who watched from parked cars, the way a single phone call had summoned an armored vehicle to her back door in under 4 minutes. Some kinds of power didn't need a name to be recognized. They announced themselves in the spaces they controlled. "You had people watching me?" she said. "Since that first night." "Since that first morning," he said. "Once I knew you'd covered a stranger with your own blanket, instead of calling it in, I needed to know who you were." Something in that admission landed harder than she expected. Not menace, but a kind of confession. The SUV curved down toward the river, toward a tower of glass and steel rising up out of the dark like something that had never once considered failure. "You'll have questions," Roman said quietly, as the vehicle slowed at an underground entrance guarded by 2 men who nodded him through without a word. "I'll answer the ones that matter. Not tonight. Tonight we deal with Marco Corvo, and then we deal with what happens to you next." "What happens to me next?" Tessa repeated, and there was an edge in it now, something sharper than fear. "I'm not something that happens, Mr. Hale. I'm a person who just had her arm nearly broken by a man protecting your name." For a moment, something shifted behind his eyes, not quite surprise, but close to it, like he wasn't used to being corrected, and wasn't entirely sure yet whether he minded it. "No," he said slowly. "You're not something that happens, a beat. You're something I intend to keep." The words settled over her like a hand closing gently, deliberately around something it had already decided belonged to it. Roman's need to possess wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was the only language a man raised inside a syndicate had ever been taught for loyalty. Beneath the control sat a quieter panic. He had lost people before, by failing to claim them fast enough, and he refused to let this become one more loss he only understood in hindsight. The real conflict was never whether to protect her, it was whether he could do it without turning her into another asset in his war. She should have been afraid of that. Some small, distant part of her was. But a larger part, the part that had spent years being overlooked, underestimated, whispered about in hallways, recognized something else in his tone entirely. For the first time since she'd found him, bleeding in that alley, someone was looking directly at her, like she mattered enough to be claimed, not dismissed. The elevator doors opened onto the top floor before she could decide what to do with that feeling. Inside, 2 of Roman's men were already waiting, with Marco Corvo seated in a hard chair in the center of a private room 3 floors below the penthouse, a room built, she understood, without being told, for exactly this kind of conversation. Marco's bravado had drained considerably in the time it took to be escorted here. His eyes flicked to Tessa the moment she entered, and something like genuine fear moved across his face for the first time. Roman didn't raise his voice. He never seemed to need to. "You put your hands on someone who isn't yours to touch," he said, circling Marco's chair slowly, each step measured like a countdown. "You said things in a hallway that weren't yours to say." "She's nobody," Marco tried, though his voice cracked on the word. "Some night shift girl who—" Roman's hand came down flat on the table beside him, not violent, just final. The sound cut Marco off mid-sentence. "She is the only reason I'm alive to have this conversation," Roman said. "Which means as of tonight, she is under my protection, which means every word you said in that hallway, you said about someone who belongs to me." Tessa stood near the door, arms still crossed, watching the scene with a strange, distant clarity, the way she sometimes watched trauma calls come through dispatch, present professional, refusing to let the horror of the moment take anything more from her than it already had. Roman turned to her before Marco's punishment continued, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to watch this part," he said. It wasn't kindness exactly. It was something closer to respect. "I'm not leaving," Tessa said. "Not until I understand exactly what I've walked into." Roman studied her for a long moment, something almost like approval flickering behind his eyes. "Fair enough," he said quietly. "Then stay. But understand, once you see this, there's no unseeing it." She held his gaze steadily. "I already crossed that line 3 nights ago, when I chose not to call an ambulance." "Then let's finish this," he said, "and get you home before sunrise." The elevator doors sealed shut behind them with a sound like held breath finally released, and for 11 floors neither of them spoke. Tessa watched the numbers climb, 12, 19, 27, and felt the pressure change in her ears the way it never had in any building she'd lived in. Roman stood a foot away, one hand braced against the rail, his jaw tight with a pain he refused to let reach his face. She noticed it anyway. 12 years of reading bodies on dispatch calls had taught her that stillness held too perfectly was its own kind of scream. The doors opened onto the 40th floor of a glass tower overlooking the Monongahela, a space built entirely of steel, stone, and floor-to-ceiling windows that made her cramped, mildew-scented apartment feel like it belonged to another century entirely. The city lay beneath them in scattered gold, and somewhere far below, invisible now, was the alley where all of this had started. "You live like this?" she said quietly, "and you almost died behind a dumpster." "Money doesn't stop knives," Roman said. "It just decides who's holding one." Roman moved ahead of her, still stiff from his injury, and shrugged out of his coat to reveal a white shirt freshly soaked through at the side where his wound had reopened. In the low light of the hallway, the stain looked black instead of red, and she caught the faint metallic smell of it before she'd even fully processed what she was seeing. Her professional instincts overtook everything else instantly. "You need that redone properly," she said, already reaching for her sleeves. "Now, before it gets worse." He tilted his head toward the master bathroom without argument. Inside, the light was warmer than the rest of the apartment, almost deliberately so, and she found a trauma kit far too comprehensive to belong to an ordinary household, the kind of medical supplies stocked by people who expected to need them regularly. Suture kits still in sterile packaging, 3 different grades of gauze, a vial of something she didn't recognize but suspected she wasn't supposed to ask about. She snapped on gloves, and the small latex snaps seemed enormous in the silence. Roman sat on the edge of the marble counter, shirt open, watching her hands with an intensity that had nothing to do with pain tolerance and everything to do with the fact that no one had touched him like this, carefully, without an agenda, in longer than he was willing to admit. "This is going to sting," she warned, pressing antiseptic to the wound's edge. He didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "I've had worse." "That's not an answer to what I said. That's a deflection." She glanced up at him, needle poised. "Who taught you to do that? Answer a question with a fact instead of a feeling?" Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite surprise, more like being caught mid-sentence in a language he thought no one else spoke. "My father," he said finally. "And then my brother finished the lesson." She didn't push. She filed it away instead, the way she'd filed away the compass tattoo and the burned scrap of paper, pieces of a man who gave information out only when the wound demanded it. The stitches went in clean, 6 of them, her hands steadier than her heartbeat had any right to be. When she tied off the last one, the building hummed faintly around them, the distant sound of a heating system working too hard against December. A city's worth of noise filtered down to almost nothing 40 floors up. "There," she said, peeling off her gloves. "Try not to reopen it by threatening anyone else tonight." "No promises." But something in his voice had softened just slightly, the way ice softens right before it starts to crack. He watched her clean up the supplies with the same efficiency she'd used on him, and when she finally sat back, exhaustion catching up to her all at once, he spoke without preamble. Corvo is just a dog. The real owner sits in Harrisburg. Then he handed her a thick stack of ledgers that needed sorting before morning, urgent enough that his voice carried no room for refusal. She sat down at his desk, still in her coat, the cold of the alley 3 nights ago still somehow living in her bones despite the penthouse's warmth. The desk lamp threw a small, private circle of light across the papers, and for a moment the rest of the apartment, the wealth, the danger, the man bleeding beside her, fell away into shadow. It was just her and the numbers, the one language that had never once lied to her. Within 12 seconds, not 12 minutes, 12 seconds, she pointed to 3 lines of numbers that didn't match, discrepancies his entire team had somehow missed for weeks. Her finger tapped the page twice, precise the way she used to tap a calculator key back when she still believed her life was headed toward a corner office instead of a night shift headset. Roman went still. "Say that again," he said. "Your transfers out of the Harrisburg account are structured to look like maintenance fees," she said. "But maintenance fees don't fluctuate by exactly 4% every 11 days. That's not upkeep. That's someone skimming on a schedule." He leaned over her shoulder close enough that she could feel the warmth still radiating off him from the stitches close enough to smell the antiseptic she'd just used on his skin. 4%, he repeated almost to himself. Every 11 days. "Ledgers don't have opinions," she said. "That's why I trust them more than people." When he looked at her again, something in his expression had fundamentally changed. He was no longer looking at someone who needed protecting. He was looking at someone who could stand beside him. "Numbers don't lie," Tessa said simply. "People do." He didn't try to hide what came next. "The morning after I left your apartment, I had you looked into. The scholarship you lost, your mother's hospital debt, the bookkeeping work you've been doing quietly for years off the books after midnight." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "I know all of it. I needed someone who could read numbers without flinching at blood. You're not just someone I'm protecting, Tessa. You're the thing I was missing." For a moment she said nothing, letting the words move through her the way heat moves through a body that's been cold too long. She thought of her mother's handwriting on old hospital forms, the acceptance letter she'd folded into a shoebox and never looked at again, every professor who'd told her she had a gift for this, right before the gift became a luxury she couldn't afford. Nobody had said those words to her in 8 years. Nobody had even come close. "You had me investigated before you even knew my name," she said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was closer to disbelief. "I knew your name by morning," Roman said. "I just didn't know what to do with everything else about you until I watched you find 4% in 11 days. Outside the window, the river kept moving, indifferent to all of it, the way rivers always are. 3 days later, the news broke that State Senator Ethan Hale had abruptly resigned, citing health reasons. Tessa watched it happen on a muted television in Roman's kitchen, coffee going cold in her hands, the senator's face frozen mid-sentence on the screen like something already fossilized. "Half-brother," Roman said before she could ask. He didn't look up from the ledger he was pretending to read. Same father, different mother. Different rules, apparently, for which sons got to keep their consciences. It was the most he'd offered about his own family since she'd met him, and she understood without being told that it had cost him something to say it out loud. What the headlines never printed was the truth. Roman had leaked his half-brother's entire money-laundering ledger to the press, the very ledger Tessa herself had spent that long night reorganizing. Buried in the same documents, though no reporter connected it publicly, was a second name, Detective Harlan Voss, whose account had been receiving quiet deposits from Ethan's network for over a year. Within a week, Voss was quietly removed from the case and from the force entirely. No headlines, no fanfare, just a name that stopped mattering. Tessa recognized the coincidence the moment she read it. The cigarette brand she'd tucked into her pocket without knowing why had led eventually right back to him.
You knew about Voss before I found that cigarette butt? She said, studying Roman across the kitchen island. I suspected, he corrected. You confirmed it. That's the difference between a guess and evidence, and it's the difference you keep making without noticing you're making it. Marco Corvo survived, but was forced to sign a $2 million debt at an impossible interest rate. Roman didn't kill him. He let him live as a lesson written in fear rather than blood. Then Roman handed Tessa a thick envelope. Inside, a new passport and a one-way ticket to Portland. She stared at it for a long moment, the paper suddenly heavier than anything she'd held in years. "Why give me an exit," she said slowly, "the same week you tell me I'm the thing you were missing?" "Because wanting to keep someone," Roman said, "and trapping them are not the same thing. I've watched men confuse those two my whole life. I won't be one of them."
"Fly tonight," he said, "or stay. But if you stay, you don't get to pretend you don't know what I am. You don't get to pretend I'm not a mafia boss just because I make you coffee the way you like it." She held the envelope like it was a door to somewhere she couldn't yet see the other side of, understanding for the first time that choosing to stay meant choosing to step fully into his darkness. No illusions left standing. Tessa held the ticket in her hand and for a moment truly meant to use it. She made it all the way to the security gate at Pittsburgh International, boarding pass grip tight enough to wrinkle the paper, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead in a way that made everything feel too bright and too fake, like a life she was auditioning for instead of living. A gate agent's voice droned flight numbers over the intercom. A child somewhere behind her cried about a dropped toy. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary Tuesday morning sounds, and she stood in the middle of them, feeling like the only person in the terminal who understood how thin the floor really was beneath everyone's feet. Her phone buzzed. A photo of Silas Crow down on the sidewalk outside the terminal, not moving. A single message beneath it. "His brother isn't finished." Her hands went cold, the boarding pass slipping half out of her grip before she caught it again. She opened the envelope again, and this time she noticed what she'd missed before. Not one passport inside, but two. The second bore her mother's maiden name, issued only 8 days earlier, dated the same morning Roman had first had her looked into. She stood frozen in the middle of the terminal, understanding with sudden dizzying clarity that Roman had started building her an escape route almost the instant he'd learned who she was. Which meant he had planned for the possibility of her needing to disappear before she'd ever agreed to anything at all. Roman's decision to build her an exit before she'd ever agreed to stay wasn't distrust. It was the only form of tenderness a man like him knew how to offer without saying the word aloud. He had learned the hard way that the people he cared about became targets the moment anyone noticed, and preparing for her disappearance was his version of hoping for a future he didn't quite believe he deserved to keep. That contradiction, building her a door out while doing everything in his power to make her want to stay, was the truest measure of what she had come to mean to him. Before she could process it, her phone rang again. Her old college number. A voice she hadn't heard in years, a former classmate laughing cruelly through the receiver. "Heard you're shacked up with the Mafia now. Guess that's exactly the kind of thing a college dropout ends up doing. No matter how hard you try, you're still just a shadow." Tessa's grip tightened on the phone until her knuckles went white. Around her, travelers rolled suitcases past oblivious, and for one disorienting second, she felt exactly the way she had in that apartment hallway, watched, whispered about, reduced to a punchline by someone who'd never once had to choose between a scholarship and a hospital bill. This humiliation cut differently than any of the others. It wasn't about her body. It wasn't about poverty. It was a denial of the entire path she had carved out to survive, as if every sacrifice she'd made for her mother had been worthless, invisible, unworthy of respect. Tessa cut the call, steady and unshaken. Seconds later, an anonymous text appeared.
Ethan paid her to call. Don't trust anyone from your past. She realized with a chill settling deep into her bones that Ethan's network had reached all the way back into her college years, weaponizing even the ghosts of her old life against her. She turned and drove back toward the river, the boarding pass still crumpled in her coat pocket, her mind circling one quiet, unshakable thought. He built me a door before he ever asked me to walk through it. That has to mean something. Back at the penthouse, she found a second envelope waiting in her desk drawer, unopened. The apartment was empty when she arrived, Roman still at the tower, dealing with the fallout from Ethan's resignation, and for a moment she simply stood in the quiet, listening to the same building hum she'd noticed the night he'd first brought her here. Inside paperwork for a living trust already established, naming Tessa Quinn as sole beneficiary and executor of everything Roman held under legitimate ownership effective immediately. No probate, no waiting. The realization landed like a physical blow. Roman had prepared for his own death, and he had chosen her not out of love, but because she was the only person he trusted not to betray the empire he'd built. When Roman returned that evening, still favoring the side she'd stitched, she was sitting exactly where he'd left her that morning, the trust papers spread across the desk. "You could have told me," she said. "Would you have believed me?" he asked. "Or would you have run the moment you understood what it meant?" "I don't know," she admitted, and the honesty of it seemed to cost her something. "That's the truth I hate the most right now." "Then we're even," he said, "because I don't know what I'll do the day you decide you've had enough of this life either. I built the door anyway." She stood at the window for a long time, watching the black water of the Monongahela churn silently below, understanding that if she stayed, she wasn't only accepting his darkness, she would become its heir. 6 months later, Tessa sat in a small office on the 41st floor, reconciling ledgers while cold light off the river poured through the windows behind her. The office had changed since the first night she'd sorted through his papers, in her coat still shivering. There were plants now, a real chair instead of a borrowed one, a framed photo of her mother on the corner of the desk that she'd finally allowed herself to display instead of hide. The building still hummed the same way it always had. She'd simply stopped hearing it as a threat. Roman walked in with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, the Latin script along his forearm fully visible now, no longer something he bothered to hide from her. He set down a cup of coffee, made exactly the way she liked it, black, with an extra shot of espresso, and said nothing for a long moment, watching her work, the way he used to watch her stitch his wound, like something worth studying carefully. "You're staring," she said without looking up. "I'm remembering," he said. "There's a difference." Then, before speaking further, he handed her his phone. An old voice memo played, dated the night they first met. Silas's voice hushed. "Boss, there's a night dispatch. Girl EMT certified. Lives right down the block. The blood trail leads to. Should we erase it?" And then Roman's own voice, flat and certain, even then. "Leave it. I want to meet her." She listened to it twice the second time with her eyes closed, letting the words settle into a place they hadn't been able to reach the first time she'd heard them. He looked at her steadily. "I left the blood trail on purpose. Because if you hadn't found me, I would have died in that alley, and I didn't want to die without ever seeing the face of the person who saved me." "You gambled your life," she said quietly, "on the hope that a stranger would stop for a boot behind a dumpster." "I gambled my life," he corrected, "on 12 years of night shift instinct I'd read about in a file before I ever gambled on you as a person. I knew what kind of woman doesn't call an ambulance and walk away. I just didn't know I'd want to keep her." Silas himself leaned in the doorway a moment later, fully recovered, a thin new scar along his temple, the only sign of what had happened outside the airport. He said nothing, only nodded once at Tessa, the closest thing to gratitude a man like him allowed himself.
She nodded back, and something unspoken passed between them. The quiet acknowledgement of two people who'd both survived the same version of the same war. A week earlier, Marco Corvo had been forced to stand before the remnants of his own family and read aloud a statement Roman had written for him. "I disrespected the woman the boss chose. I apologize for mistaking her worth for her body." No blood, just the public collapse of everything he'd built his cruelty on. Tessa hadn't watched it happen in person. She hadn't needed to. She'd felt the shift in the building's atmosphere the same way she used to feel a storm coming off the river before the weather report ever caught up. And 2 floors below, in a sunlit corner apartment, Roman had quietly arranged the lease for Mrs. Delaney, kept her door unlocked, and her radiator finally blessedly silent, safe and never quite realizing how close she'd come to being anything else. Some evenings, Tessa still stopped by with tea, and some evenings the old woman simply asked about the weather, never once asking the questions Tessa knew she was owed answers to. It was its own kind of mercy, being allowed to keep a small piece of an ordinary life. Tessa opened her drawer and retrieved the half-burned scrap of paper from that very first night, setting it gently on the table between them. Roman looked at it for a long time before he spoke. "That wasn't an accident," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear it. "I left it there because I knew only you would be smart enough to connect 714 to Ethan and brave enough not to run. This entire war, I won it because of you, not because of me." Something in her chest finally settled quiet and whole as every humiliation she had carried, every whispered insult, every dismissive glance, every voice that had once decided her worth without asking her opinion on the matter, folded backward into something entirely different. She was no longer the woman who had been saved. She was the one who had decided how it all ended. A mafia boss doesn't get to choose the family he's born into, but he gets to choose who stands beside him when it matters, and Roman had chosen her before she'd ever chosen him back. Tessa didn't answer him in words. She simply pulled out the chair beside her own and let him sit down next to her. Outside, Pittsburgh remained as cold as it had always been. Inside, for the first time either of them could remember, no one had to shake anymore. They sat together in the pale light off the river. No kiss, just steady breathing and a cup of coffee still gently steaming between them, and a silence that finally, after everything, felt like peace. In the end, this story is about the quiet arithmetic so many of us have done without ever naming it, the years spent making ourselves smaller so someone else's comfort could stay intact, and the moment we finally stopped doing that math. Tessa didn't become powerful because a dangerous man chose her. She became powerful the day she stopped answering cruelty with an explanation because her dignity was never something she owed anyone proof of, only something she'd been asked quietly for years to apologize for. If something in this story pulled at you this morning, here's one thing that's practical instead of poetic. Call someone today who hasn't heard your voice in a while. Not to explain yourself, just to say hello. Then write down one thing you still know how to do well, something nobody's asked you about in months, and find a single person this week who could use it, a recipe, a piece of advice, an old skill you never stopped carrying. The people who once decided you were too old, too slow, or too much trouble were never actually the ones in charge of your worth. You were. You still are. What did you think of Tessa's transformation from the woman nobody looked at twice to the one who decided who won? Tell us in the comments below. If this story moved you, give it a like, share it with someone who needs a little hope tonight, and subscribe for the next journey of quiet strength and unexpected love.